Welcome back to Tangled Twists. I'm Melissa, and today we're creating the bodice for my historically adequate witch. My historically adequate witch is almost done. She only needs a bodice to be wearable and complete. I'm super excited about that. I've been looking forward to making her for a long time. For the bodice, we're going to be going a little bit off the historical technique road. We're going to be using Simplicity 8161. Yes, this should be a picture of the envelope. The envelope is somewhere. I am a chaos goblin. It is in my house. Don't ask me where. But I do have the line drawings for you. So this little beauty over here is what we're going to be working on. I am going to deviate from that a little bit. I don't like the look of just the plain bodice, so I'm going to be using additional instructions from Pattern of Fashion and American Duchess to add a peplum to that. I will have to fully draft that, so that should be interesting. But I've got lovely velvet scraps, hopefully there'll be enough, that are all ready to go, and I am anxious to get working on my new jacket. This time, instead of starting with fabric prep, we're starting with pattern prep. I iron my packaged patterns. It can be a little fiddly. The paper is very light and it tends to move and wiggle a lot, but it also tends to have sections folded over itself where small pieces of the pattern lines are obscured, and I want to get all of those out before I start using the pattern. I am a tracer because if you cut on these lines, you can only use one size, and I like to get as much use out of my patterns as I can. You can see all those pieces that would get cut off if I only cut one size out, and then I'd have to try to figure out any changes if I wanted to use another. I solve that problem by tracing my patterns. It takes a little bit longer, but it's not difficult to do. I use medical exam paper because it's kind of see-through and it's a little bit easier to use than just regular tissue paper. It also comes on handy rolls, so I'm not always grabbing pieces and having to tape them together. I can usually get all of my pieces done fairly easily without having to tape anything. I will use rulers for straight lines, and sometimes I find out that the lines aren't straight, which is what happened here. If I have a straight line, I will use a ruler to trace it out. Otherwise, I just very gently go by hand. I'm using a number 2 pencil instead of a mechanical pencil for this, because mechanical pencils have very sharp lead and it gets a lot more rounded on a number 2 pencil. It's less likely to tear the paper as you're working on it. Since I'm not cutting the pattern out, I have to make sure all of the pattern information gets transferred over. That includes the piece, the size, all of the markings. I need to make sure all of those are good and ready to go before I start cutting the pieces out. Then it's just like any other pattern that you're using. I do recommend not stacking them together like this. There was a very big chance of me accidentally cutting the original pattern when I was cutting things out, but generally it works about the same. And honestly, I find this to be a little bit easier because I'm working with a much smaller piece than those big pieces that you see underneath the piece that I'm cutting. It's a lot easier to handle. I have all of my pattern pieces traced out there. They're all rolled up. I can turn things around very easily, and it makes it very quick and simple to get everything cut and ready for use. With all my pattern pieces cut out, I can start cutting out fabric for a mock-up. I wanted to mock this up because the pattern is not intended to go over fully historical stays, and I know from the measurements on the envelope that I'm going to definitely need to take in the waist, and there might be some other fitting issues as well. I am attempting to be sneaky here. The fabric that I'm using is a rayon that I intend to use for the lining of the bodice, because I know that when you have something that you're taking in, you don't have to add fabric to it. The pieces aren't likely to need to be bigger, and the goal here is to be able to use that mock-up once it's been fitted as a lining and maybe save me a couple steps. That's not how it turned out, but it is a really practical way to try to conserve fabric and conserve a little bit of time when you're working on a pattern that you don't expect to need a lot of changes. Once I have all of those pieces cut out, I can come through and start marking all of the pattern markings from the pattern onto the fabric. I like to do this before I move any of the pieces, especially if I'm working with a wiggly fabric like rayon. You can never quite get it back into the same shape, so I like to make sure that I haven't shifted the pattern before I start putting these marks on. And I'm working on a sleeve right now. sleeves and I are not friends for different reasons than most people. I tend to make 2 of the same sleeve, so I do always try to be very careful when I'm marking things to make sure that everything is being marked on the proper side. So in this case, when I have a left and right sleeve, I end up with a left and right sleeve instead of ending up with 2 right sleeves or 2 left sleeves. Not that that doesn't sometimes happen anyway, but that little bit of extra attention at this point can be really useful. With all of my pieces marked, I can start putting things together for assembly. I don't like to do this step by step. I find that that's a really inefficient way to use my time. I'm familiar enough with sewing that generally what I do is I assemble as many pieces as I reasonably can before I start trying to put them together. You don't want to do too many pieces because you can get some unwieldy final pieces or things that are difficult to press, but I can pin all of my sleeves, double checking to make sure that there is a right and a left sleeve, and I can pin parts of the bodice back. Those aren't going to interfere with each other, and it means that when I go sit at the sewing machine, I'm not doing a seam, get up, press, pin a seam, sew a seam, get up, press. It's just such a pain to have to do it that way. I definitely prefer the ability to just sit and get as much done in each sitting as I absolutely can. It's a lot less frustrating for me that way. A quick note before we get sewing, this is what can happen if you sew over your pins. Your needle hits it, it bends the pin, it can jam your machine, it can break your needle. It isn't safe. I do it anyway. I obviously pull out the long pins when I'm cross pinning like this, but if my needle fails to jump that pin, that is what can happen. So do what I do at your own risk. I'm getting started here by sewing the darts on the ends of the sleeves. This is a little bit different from just seaming up the back of a regular pattern piece. I need to work towards the fold on this, and then I don't knot the thread. I do get all the way up to the edge because if you don't, it can make your dart pucker, and I don't want that. I'm also not using the cutting feature on my machine. I'm pulling that thread out and I'm snipping it so that I can tie it off and have a neat edge. Then it's back to business as usual, doing all of my seams the way I would normally do it, knotting and cutting off the thread. I've got a 5/8 inch seam allowance that I'm working with here. That's pretty standard on purchased patterns. And I just go and zip along all of the seams that I've pre-pinned and gotten ready for the step. After every batch of sewing, I have a batch of pressing that I need to do. This is something that I used to skip. I don't recommend that. Pressing your pattern pieces like this is one of the best ways to make sure that your garment looks very professional. I remove all of my pins and then I press the seam just the way I've sewn it. That helps to lock in all of the threads and will give you a crisper seam when you open it up and press it out from there. It gets a little bit fiddly with the darts sometimes. So I have this ham. They call it a ham even though it's not the one that's shaped like a ham would normally be. And this allows me to really get into those points and make sure that the piece is pressed very, very neatly. If that's not working or you don't have a tool like that, you can also press nose in with your iron point and kind of tug on the fabric. It'll accomplish the same thing and your seams will look much, much nicer for it. And since my ironing board is a flat surface and I just took out a whole bunch of pins over here, I usually do my next set of pinning straight from the ironing board since everything's already there. I'll get set up to do the next batch of sewing. In this case, I'm pinning the side back panels to continue making the back piece. Once the bodice is assembled, it's time to do a fitting. You'll notice I haven't put the sleeves on this yet. That's because the changes that I'm going to need to make to the bodice could affect the fit of the sleeves, so it's always best to start with the bodice first. And you can probably see that this needs a lot of fitting. There's a massive gap at the back. I'm fitting it by myself, which is a bit of a challenge, so I'm using my handy dandy mirror and trying to keep pins nearby. And from there, it's a lot of pinching fabric, pinning fabric, patting it down, feeling where the wrinkles are, and trying my best to figure out exactly what I need to take out from where. This is a very tedious process for the beginning, especially because I'm trying to do this on my back. It made it really, really challenging. After fighting with it for a while, I went ahead and put it on one of my mannequins. The mannequin doesn't have the right waist measurement, but this is going to help a lot with general fit. I need to take a lot of fabric out of this. You can see I've marked it with chalk in a couple places. That's in part because I had a really hard time telling where seams were supposed to sit. The underarm seam here is farther towards the back than I'm used to, and I'm not sure at this point if that's correct or not. So I've marked where that seam would go if it were a modern piece. And I've used this opportunity to really start pinning in along the back because I know that curve on the back is going to be fairly accurate. But again, this is just to get it a little bit closer for a quick try on. Since the mannequin isn't exactly the size that I am in my stays, I do need to come back and try it on again to see how those changes have affected the fit. It's made a lot of improvements at this point. There are still more areas that I can work on to get this fit even better, and that's where things started to get a little bit interesting. I've marked out a lot of changes, but there's one problem, and that's that I'm not familiar really with 18th century bodices, which means it's time to go back to my references. In the line drawings, I can see how the seams fit, I can see how the waists fit, how the pieces are supposed to go together. Since I want to add a peplum, I can look at the pattern mock-ups and see how that matches what the waist seam is, so that when I'm correcting that, I know what I'm doing. I'm also cross-referencing with the American Duchess book to see more about how that fit works, because here I have pictures of it on an actual person, and I can see the seam that I was worried about is supposed to sit farther back than an underarm seam would now, which is really reassuring to know. After I confirmed the way that everything was supposed to fit, I started transferring my mock-up notes onto the pattern pieces themselves, and this is where things started to go a little bit sideways. Normally, this is a very straightforward process. You mark what you need to change, you recut the pieces that you need to recut. I did need to recut for this because I needed to extend the length of a lot of panels. Generally, that's all I would need, but this one was just not cooperating. You can see I've got some really big back gaps along the back edge. I wound up doing, I think, 5 mock-ups for this, so my brilliant idea of using my lining fabric and making this easy didn't really pay off, and I wound up using a lot more of nicer fabric than I would have preferred for this. I typically keep track of all of my changes on the pattern by using lots of different colors. My first change might be red, my second change might be blue. That way I can kind of follow all of the changes that I'm making, make sure that I'm accounting for seam allowance. But you can see I've already taped a lot of things to this pattern piece. They're starting to look a little manhandled. It just took so long to start getting this fit dialed in, and I really wanted to leave this in here, not the full extent of it, because this took me hours upon hours to do. But I think this is something that's really important, especially for beginner sewists, because things don't always work out the way you want, and it can get really frustrating. You'll get there. It takes some time, but you will eventually get there, and you'll really appreciate the way that everything fits after you've spent all that time on it. But it can be extremely frustrating to do when you're on version 3, when you're on version 4, and things still aren't fitting correctly. So when I got to something that was pretty okay, I started looking at the next piece that I was going to need to confirm the fit, and that is the secret to when you have projects that are very frustrating. When you're working on a full outfit project like this, there are usually other pieces that you can jump to and work on. In this case, I grabbed the pattern for the stomacher. I had planned to make this near the end because it's easy, but I needed an easy win that could help me clear my head from all of the nightmare that was fitting the bodice. So I got that out. I started cutting out my pieces. I started marking the boning channels for it. I use a ruler when I have straight lines like this. I can mark the top and bottom positions on the fabric from the pattern, and then instead of trying to hand draw a straight line, I like to use my clear ruler. It just makes life a lot easier. And once all of those marks are transferred, I checked my boning stash to see what I could use for this bodice. It wanted me to use the featherweight boning you can get in basically any sewing store. I don't like that boning. It's kind of unwieldy, so I'm using my synthetic whalebone that I keep in my corset stash. I decided that what I really wanted to do here was use some of my finer boning. I think it's about 4 millimeters wide, which means I needed to split all of the boning channels, but I really like the look that I wound up with at the end. When you're doing boning channels, it's important to start at the center of whatever piece you're working on and work outward. A lot of times when you are sewing like this, your fabric will shift. You want any of that weirdness to shift outward away from the centerpiece. If you don't do it that way, you can end up with bubbles, you can end up with your fabric twisting in weird ways. That's also why I'm doing every one of these channels from the top to the bottom. By doing it that way, I'm not twisting the fabric, I'm not pushing it one direction and then pushing it another and having unsightly bubbles form in my boning casings. By the time I was done, my green side was a little bit messy. I went ahead and trimmed up as much of that as I could. I'm not really worried about that because that will get cut off when I go to bind this. You'll also notice that I've stitched around the seam allowance on the bottom edge. That's to give my boning something to stop against. I also needed to mark the seam allowance across the top so that I would know how long I needed each of those boning pieces to be. Cutting the boning is pretty easy. I just laid it out, marked with my fingers about where I needed it to be cut, and moved from channel to channel. I did go ahead and tuck them into each channel as I went so that I would make sure that I kept all of my pieces together and didn't lose anything. That's also really useful for keeping which bone goes in which channel straight because they all do look the same. The thing with cut boning though is that the ends tend to be sharp and can cut through your fabric, which means I needed to go through and take each of those bones and file the edges down so that nothing would get caught anywhere or make it easy to poke holes through my fabric. It's a messy process. Make sure that you have something underneath to catch all the plastic filings when you do this. You can see that they're already starting to collect on the stomacher, and I've only done one so far. It is messy, it's time consuming, but it is very worth doing. The last step for the stomacher is binding, so I need to trim down the seam allowance so that I don't end up with a really bulky bound edge. That also means securing the top edge along that marked seam allowance line. This will help keep the bones in place, and then I can trim this down and get to the binding. I'm using single fold bias tape for this, and I will secure all the way around. I intend for my green side to be the front side to use as an accent color, so I'm pinning right sides together there first. That way the neatest possible edge is the one that you're going to see. Then it's time for lots of hand sewing. On this side, I'm going to be using a back stitch to go all the way around the edge of the stomacher, and that will secure the binding to the right side. When the right side is secure, I fold the binding over to the back and I begin to whip stitch it all the way around. This wound up bending my needle actually, because when I had to go around the bones, it got a little bit fiddly, but it went surprisingly quickly, all things considered. When I wasn't going over the bones and I was in the normal fabric stretch, it went pretty fast and I had a stomacher before I knew it. After my break with the stomacher, it's time to get back to the bodice. A little bit less frustrated, but really wanting to move ahead, so I am pleating the top of the sleeve head so that I can start getting the sleeves into the bodice. They require a pleat at the very top that's supposed to point toward the back, and from there I will be setting in the sleeves by hand. When possible, I always set my sleeves in by hand. It's much easier to pick them out when you've made an inevitable mistake. They're also a lot easier to handle if you're doing it by hand rather than by machine. It gives you a lot more control, and I find that you get a much nicer result from it. The one downside here, though, is that I have to measure and mark where my seam allowance needs to be. If I were to do this on a machine, I could just use the marks that are there, but I'm not doing it that way because I really like the control that I get when I do this by hand. So I have to do a quick mark all the way around before I start my stitching. At long last, I have a workable pattern and a workable lining. Now I'm going to test exactly how well this fits. I raise my arms above my head and out in front of me. I do this to see if anything's going to strain before I finalize the pattern, I want to make sure that everything fits really nicely, and it does get a little tight across the back, but that is easy enough to fix. The sleeves were also a little tight, so while I was unpicking things to restitch within the seam allowance, I didn't need to recut. I'm also taking the time to mark the hem edge of the cuffs. They're to be turned in and then slip stitched together with the outer shell to finish that edge. I think it'll look really nice that way, and it's the easiest way I could think of to do the installation on the sleeves. We are finally on to the part that's supposed to be fun, but isn't really, because I have all of these scraps of velvet, and I have to figure out how to get all of my pattern pieces and a peplum that I haven't patterned yet out of this. You're going to see me petting the velvet a lot. That's so that I can tell where the nap of the fabric is. It doesn't really matter what direction I put the nap in, as long as all of the pieces are cut the same. To figure out the best way to do that was a lot of trial and error. I positioned and repositioned pattern pieces across all of my velvet scraps multiple times before I finally came up with a configuration that would allow me to get all of the pieces that I needed, as well as leave a large chunk of fabric behind, so that when I went to do the peplum, whose size I don't know yet, I would still be able to do it. I chose to do it this way because I can make a bodice without a peplum, but if I have a peplum without a bodice, that's kind of silly. So my main focus was making sure of all of the bodice pieces so that I would be able to at least have that portion done. Once I had a layout that I thought would work, I went and traced all of my pattern pieces onto the back of the velvet. That was to help me really visualize what fabric that I was using, to confirm that everything was on the same grain, and to go through and make sure that I had traced out every single piece that I needed and still had a good amount left for the peplum. These scraps are all the velvet that I have for this, so I can't afford to make a mistake. I have to make sure that everything is where it belongs, that I have one of each side of each piece, and that there is sufficient fabric remaining for the peplum of as yet unknown size. Since I verified that all of my pieces would fit, I can move on with cutting everything out. I'm still checking periodically to make sure that the nap on everything lines up while I could potentially do something about it. Again, there's not a lot I can do here, but I really didn't want to mess this fabric up. It didn't take me long to get everything neatly cut out and ready to go, but there are some unusual considerations you have to make with velvet. I try to handle the pieces as little as possible, so once I have them cut out, I'm matching them with their pairs and setting them aside. The reason is that velvet sheds, and it sheds really badly. Always use an easily cleanable surface because there is an absurd amount of stuff that will come off. I mean, just look at that. The other fun thing with velvet is that it has a pile. What you see on my ironing board is called a needle board, and it is used to support all of the fuzz on the velvet so that when I press it, it doesn't get crushed. It's a very handy tool to have, but you can see it's very small. These don't come very large, and you have to be very careful running your iron over them because they do have metal pins and it can scratch your iron. So it makes ironing a little bit more of a tedious process. You'll see that I'm doing it on cut pieces instead of whole fabric. That's because of the size of the needle board and how hard it is to iron things effectively with it when they're very large and unwieldy. With all my pieces pressed and pinned, we are back to the sewing machine for the final steps of this bodice. I'm going to be working through all of them just like I did on my mock-up / lining. It's a pretty quick process. I'm still using my batch sewing because it's easier. And then I'm going straight back to the ironing board like I did before, again with my needle board to press out all of those seams. You use the needle board as often as you can. If you don't have a needle board, you can use a towel. They're not always as effective, but it's better than just laying the velvet on a really hard ironing board. Assembly is identical to what it was when I was working on the mock-up lining, except I need to turn the bottom edge of my bodice up. I'm doing this on the lining as well. That's part of how everything will be assembled with the peplum later on. Then it's time to start attaching the lining to the shell. I like to start at the center back and work out from both sides. It helps keep the fabric in line a little bit better. You'll also notice that anytime I have a seam that I can match on the lining and the shell, I take that opportunity. It's a really great way to make sure that everything comes out looking really nice and neat. And I will work my way around the entire front and neck edge, leaving the bottom edge open. I need to put a little bit of boning in the front to support the eyelets, and I'm also going to need to put the peplum in once I have it ready. But I can't do anything for the peplum until this step is done, because I have to be able to measure that bottom edge to know what I'm working with for the peplum. All right, let's make a peplum. I've got my measurements ready. I'm predominantly going to follow the American Duchess supplementary material, but I'm aiming for something like these extant examples, so I'm referencing the pattern books there as well to kind of get a feel for what it is I'm doing. First, I need to make my nice big rectangle so that I can cut it apart and flare it to make the peplum. I will say that I did this wrong initially and had to go back through and redo a couple of things. I used the wrong set of measurements, so my peplum flared out way more than it was supposed to. It also started out being too long, so I did need to trim all those little rectangles down a little bit. Once I had them cut and flared, I was able to tape them down to my paper surface so that I could start adding that curve to it. This was where I had made a mistake before. I was using a gap that was about twice the size that it needed to be instead of about the 2.5 inches that I needed here. So I used my ruler to match the points of each of the rectangles and tape things down as I go to get all of that spread out and to make a really nice clean curve. I also need to add a little bit of extra material on both ends of the peplum. That's so that it will go nice and neatly straight down in the front and in the back. And then I can start kind of connecting those dots to make that curved shape that I've been looking for here. I then need to go and add seam allowance all the way around this. Even though I'm not done with the patterning yet, this is a good place to put the seam allowance on. I'm going to be cutting this in half so that I can add some bigger pleats to it. And if I put the seam allowance on it now, that makes it easier to account for that later on. When my seam allowance is added and my initial pattern is cut out, I mark the center front and center back and my cut line. I've measured this so that it falls about where the side seam is going to be, and I'm going to cut my pattern in half. I'm doing this so that I can add a nice deep pleat along the side that I saw and liked in my reference image. The easiest way to do this is by cutting those pieces apart and adding some additional paper so that I can make the pleat shape from there. I've taped my paper to one side of my pattern, and then I'm going to be folding that to start getting the shape that I need for my pleat. Once I have it established on one side about how deep I want it, that's going to tell me where the center of that's going to be. I can mark that and then use the distance that I've measured to mark the other side. That way my two pleat halves will be somewhat even, and I'm able to make sure that my pieces line up somewhat in real time to get the general idea of the shape of the pattern that I'm going for. You can see as I open it up, there's a lot of material that's being added to the center of this. Then I need to clean up the bottom edge of my pattern. Pleats get a little weird. The fabric does not always make the shape that you would expect it to, so it's best in this instance to go ahead and trim that bottom edge off. When I open it up, you'll see what I mean, how it's got those little scallops to it now. That's one of the fun things with pleats, but I now have a pattern. I just need to clean it up a little bit more and split it in half. I need to split it in half so that I can keep the nap of the fabric going in the right direction with my grain lines, but I've got a peplum pattern. We are now in the final stretch. I can take those peplum pieces and start cutting out the velvet. I got really lucky here. I had thought that I was going to use my biggest chunk of velvet for this, but it turns out with the shape of the pieces that I have, I'm actually able to use a much narrower piece than I was expecting. That was really nice because it let me have a good sized chunk of velvet left over, so if I need to make repairs or changes, I do have a little bit of extra for that. The peplum assembly is a little bit different because I'm not lining it. I stitched around the edge at the seam allowance on my machine so that it would be easily marked. I didn't want to do it by hand at this point because I just wanted it done. From there, I'm able to pin and tuck the hems all the way around and then whip stitch that down. I have to make sure all of these edges are clear because you've seen how much velvet sheds. I don't need that and I don't need fraying, so I'm being extra careful to make sure that everything is neatly tucked away on all of my peplum pieces. Hand sewing on velvet is about like hand sewing on anything else, except it is a little bit easier, I find. Because you have all that pile, it's a lot easier to make sure your needle doesn't stick out and get thread where you don't want it to be seen. So I'm able to make very invisible hems on all of this, which just looks absolutely delightful when it's finished. The peplum is done as 2 pieces, so I make my pleat at my side seam first and then work out to either side, matching the center back. I have it pinned, but before I sew, I base that down, because sewing with that many pins is going to make it really challenging, and it gets stitched along that bottom edge of the bodice to hold everything in place. I'm ready to put in the front boning channel on the bodice, so I am measuring the size of my boning and adjusting my needle so that when I put the edge of the fabric under, I'll create a channel that is the correct size for the boning that I'm using. This only goes down the center front, and its job is to help stabilize the front and to support the eyelets when the bodice is laced. I don't need a lot here, I just need a little bit to help support those eyelets. This isn't going to be under a great deal of tension, so I don't need to really overkill it and do a whole bunch here. I'm using synthetic whalebone to go in those front channels, so I need to cut my piece to size and make it a little bit shorter so that it can definitely fit all the way in there. I do need to have rounded ends, which I already do on this. I like to keep pieces that I don't use for other projects just to make sure I have them on hand. And then it's just a matter of sliding those pieces in and making sure that they go to the depth that they're supposed to so that I can finish up that bottom edge. I can now start securing the lining to the bodice so that I can get all of those pieces stitched into place. It takes a little bit of pinning, and again, I'm starting in the center back and working outward. That way everything stays as even as it's possible to be. It does get a little fiddly. It's kind of hard when you're pinning in the middle of fabric like I am here, but after a little bit of fussing around, I'm able to get everything neatly secured. Whipping down the lining is something that I like to do by hand, especially when I have a little fiddly bit like the bottom of that boning channel that I need to work around. If I tried to do this on machine, there's a good chance that that would end up coming out of position and not ending up as nice and neat as I would prefer it to. So the most fiddling happens there, and then after that, it's just a matter of working down along the lining, connecting it to the bodice, trying hard not to come all the way through the velvet so that the stitches aren't particularly visible from the other side. That leaves the sleeve cuffs as the final part that requires hand sewing, and I'm going to use a stitch here that I don't usually end up using. It's called a slip stitch or a ladder stitch, and it's used to make invisible closures. You see this oftentimes when you turn a lining on a modern style jacket. They'll have you leave a slit open in the center back that you pull everything through, and this method lets you make that invisible. It grabs a little bit of fabric on one side and then a little bit of fabric on the other side. So when you pull it apart, it looks a little bit like a ladder, and it does a great job at connecting things seamlessly. It's just a little more fiddly than I prefer to work with. My final step is to apply my eyelets. I use my leather punch to punch a hole so I can insert the front of the eyelet in through the velvet side. I position that on my eyelet setter and pound them in. I'm not going to do this live because it shakes all of my recording equipment if I do, but this is the general process that I use to go through and set all my eyelets. I absolutely do not have the words to describe to you how much I love my historically adequate witch. I had no idea she was going to turn out as perfectly as she did. It's very uncommon for me to have a project that turns out almost identically to the sketch, which is also the image that I have in my head for a project. This one absolutely nailed it. And where the real surprise is that I like this enough that I want to make more. I always thought of myself going more towards like the Vicwardian dark academia thing, Apparently not. Apparently I'm an 18th century girl. Who knew? The bodice could use some more fitting around the waist. It does have a couple creases that show that the fit's not quite right, but it also fits when I'm not wearing stays. I did give it a try on that way, and I realized when I did that it would make an absolutely adorable formal or dress type coat. I'm gonna have to get more velvet because I have to have that now. I am absolutely in love with this thing. It's definitely my most favorite project of this year. It might be my most favorite project in the last 5. There's just something about this outfit that I can't get enough of it. So I'm going to do a couple other things because I need a variety of outfits in my life, but I'm definitely coming back to my 18th century look. It has been just too much fun. But I don't want to burn you out on too much of what I love because there's a lot of other things out there. So stick around. We're going to be starting on a whole new set of projects real soon. I'll see you then.